Okay, let's get Colin Liddell onto the show. Colin Liddell, anything about this Joe Biden cognitive decline story that you find particularly interesting?
Not really. It's just some guy who's really old and who's starting to behave in the way that we kind of expect people of his age to behave. And of course, the only remarkable thing is that he managed to end up as president of the United States at this very advanced age. So I think it's all pretty obvious. The guy's too old for the job. He shouldn't have been there in the first place. He kind of ended up there as a kind of anti-Trump. Back in 2020, the Democratic Party was a bit stuck for somebody of a similar kind of name recognition and status to go up against Trump, and they landed on him. And it seemed to just about work with the way that the election was run. But there was a downside, which was that he was pretty much too old, pretty much senile. And, they were hoping that maybe he could hold together for a few more months until the election was over. But, that strategy has been exposed as pretty much a gamble. So I think they've lost the gamble with Biden.
So do you think that the media undercovered this story? Do you think they're engaged in a partisan conspiracy to silence this story? What's your perspective on the media and the story of Joe Biden's obvious decline?
Well, I think the media didn't really hide this from us very well, so it's been an open secret. They might have been emphasizing Biden's positives. And, in a way, I guess the Biden administration has kind of held things together, but it's always been about who's the top guy. He might have some quite competent people working for him, but it's all about the top guy at the end of the day. And they were kind of hoping that the wheels would come off Trump first. And Trump's he's still hanging on. He obviously has his problems, and probably any other candidate besides Joe Biden would be able to blow him apart at this stage.
What would you anticipate from a second Donald Trump term in office?
Well, I think Donald Trump, basically his goal is to be accepted and to be assimilated into the ruling elite. And so he likes to be liked. And, he's not as radical as a lot of people fear. He would push certain policies, and, whether you agree with those policies or not, you could say they are legitimate policies. He wants to change the relationship with Europe and within NATO, and he takes a different view towards Putin. He's more of an appeaser, we could say. He kind of basically wants to give the Sudetenland to Putin, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is the significance of what appears to be a massive victory coming for the Labour Party in the United Kingdom?
No, we don't know that. I mean, the only poll that matters is the one that takes place on election day, and after all of the votes have been duly counted and the spoilt ballots removed.
Well, Labour seems to have an effective strategy, and they seem to have run a disciplined campaign, and they seem to be led by someone who's pragmatic and disciplined. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, Labour are actually quite clever at running elections. They do take elections seriously. They do take politics quite seriously. The Conservative Party, by contrast, it tends to take a more amateurish view of politics and politicking. And that's because most of the people in the Conservative Party are quite well off. They've got other irons in the fire. Whereas for the Labour Party core members, the Labour Party is the only game in town. That is their way up. It's their greasy pole, it's their ladder. And so they do take politics a bit more seriously. They tend to be more professional at politics. And they've played this campaign quite carefully. They've kept their powder dry. They've kept their cards close to their chest. They've tried not to spook the horses, etc., etc. And the Tories, unfortunately for them, as the incumbent, they've been the recipient of all this dark energy and bad karma that's been released over the last few years. And they haven't really found an effective strategy to deflect that. And so it's kind of been a bit unfair what's happened to Rishi Sunak in a way. And I think he'll be glad to just get out of it. I mean, one theory is that he actually called the election this early because he just wanted to get it over and done with.
Now, one issue that has not worked out to the Conservatives' advantage is immigration. They keep promising to crack down on immigration, but they have not been very effective. They seem to be insuperable obstacles for the government in Britain to crack down on immigration. It just seems to be a task that's too difficult for them. Any thoughts on that issue in particular in Great Britain?
It's a complex issue, but one of the things that I was thinking about today was that the problem is that Britain aspires to be an egalitarian society, and what that means is that people at the bottom of the heap have a sense of social injustice, and also people at the bottom of society are unwilling to do the kind of jobs that you expect the underclass to do. And so if your own underclass is reluctant to do the jobs that they should be doing and are preferring to stay on welfare or hold out for something better, then you end up almost having to import a new underclass. And then that new underclass manages to assimilate itself into the egalitarian welfare culture. And then you have to kind of rinse and repeat. So there are a lot of structural problems with the problem of demographics and immigration and the way that labour is apportioned through the economy. I think Rishi's government has been trying to tackle this a bit belatedly. And I also think a lot of the immigration upsurge was down to the kind of fecklessness of Boris Johnson, who kind of took his eye off the ball in a lot of ways, and who was always kind of quite accommodating with people who had a word in his ear. And there are a lot of lobby groups in the UK that favour immigration. One of them is the NHS. They're very keen to bring in cheap labour from overseas to tackle the various demeaning tasks that the NHS has to handle. We also have a massive educational sector. A lot of that is run on foreign students. A lot of those foreign students actually use education visas to come into the country and do other jobs, and not strictly to study. So there's been a lot of basic negligence and kind of wishful thinking about immigration in Britain. And the Conservative Party kind of woke up a bit late and realised that this was going to really bite them on the butt. And they started to try to do something. They came up with this Rwanda policy, which I always thought it was a bit unworkable. It was going to break down at some stage. I mean, even if they got re-elected, I'm sure this Rwanda policy would have broken down. It wouldn't have provided the deterrent they were hoping to. Rishi was also clamping down on all these additional visas, like for family members of people coming to study in the UK, things like that. But it was all rather unconvincing, and it seemed to be because they were losing popularity with their core voters, and an election was on the horizon. And so you couldn't really trust the Conservatives to continue with their sort of belated hardline on immigration if they had been successful in this election. I also think that a big factor in their demise will be the spoiler role played by the third party, which is in this case, the Reform UK party.
And what's your read on Nigel Farage deciding to jump into this election?
Well, with Nigel Farage, I think there's a lot of red flags about him. There's no smoking gun, but there's lots of red flags. He's a very suspicious character. It looks like he got orders from Moscow to, revive this sort of dissident project. And it seems to have had some effect if the polls are to be believed. But of course, we don't really know if the polls will pan out quite as we expect. This is something of an outlier. So the pollsters could be quite wrong in a number of ways, but it definitely looks like the Conservative Party isn't going to do very well. And a big part of that will be Nigel Farage's Reform UK. So it looks like Reform UK won't achieve very much. They might succeed in getting one or two seats, possibly slightly more. but they'll just disappear after that. The Conservative Party will probably shrink to between like 150 to 170 seats, and there'll be quite a weak opposition to a Labour Party that will then benefit from the divisions of their opposition. And the Labour Party will be getting probably less votes than under Jeremy Corbyn, but a lot more seats.
Now, it seems like both Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak probably have about 40 IQ points on Joe Biden. They probably have about 20 IQ points on Donald Trump. It seems like the average British politician has 15 IQ points on his American counterpart. Do you agree with that rough guess of a cognitive difference between British politicians and American politicians? And then do you agree with my analysis that it doesn't seem to create more effective government?
Well, I don't think you can directly compare Britain and America. Britain and America occupy quite different situations and are on the end of quite different histories. So the challenges of ruling one are certainly not equal to the challenges of ruling the other. And, you can take your pick there. British politicians might sound more intelligent, but that's just because of the fancy way they talk. So it's very hard to evaluate their IQ. Of course, with Joe Biden, we're not really evaluating his IQ so much as his PQ, his Parkinson's quotient.
And what do you make of the rise of the National Front in France?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something that's been on the cards for quite some time. And I think Macron was kind of brought in as a spoiler. At the time, I thought he was very much a kind of astroturfed candidate. He was somebody who was kind of patched together in some back room in order to frustrate the National Rally's ascendancy to a degree of power. And he was, I guess, successful in doing that. But the sort of Macron project has kind of run out of road now, it seems. And, he's sort of going to done a Theresa May. Because, I don't know, I mean, this might be too much detail for your listeners, but back in 2016, when Theresa May succeeded David Cameron as Tory Prime Minister in the wake of Brexit, she had quite a narrow majority, and her big plan was to hold an election. And, she was running 20 points ahead of Labour at the time, and she thought, if I run an election now, I'll be able to boost my majority and strengthen my grip on power. And that will put me in a much better position with regard to the Brexit negotiations. But she made some unfortunate mistakes, which in her case, this was trying to tax people's property in order to pay for a boost in social care for elder people. And this was soon characterized as a kind of death tax, sort of taxing people's houses after they died, and people wouldn't be able to pass their property on to their children and so on. And this alienated a lot of the older voters. And so she sort of barely survived against Jeremy Corbyn by the skin of her teeth. And I think Macron kind of did that in France. He looked at the finances and he realized that, they couldn't afford all these generous retirement benefits for French boomers. And so he raised the retirement age, I think, up to 67. And that upset a lot of older people as well. And so that made Macron a lot less popular than he otherwise might have been. So it's not exactly effective politics to alienate the boomer.
So as I've gotten older, I've noticed a decline in mental quickness, a decline in my short-term memory. I often have to struggle to remember words or elementary facts. Have you noticed any change in your cognitive powers as you age?
Not really, because as I age, I kind of structure what I know about the world much more effectively. And so I effectively boost my IQ, almost every year as I get older. So it's brilliant.
And what's going on in Japanese politics?
Well, Japanese people are where British people will probably be in 20 years, which is completely depoliticized. I think this is going to be, in some respects, quite a depoliticizing election. And Japanese people, they don't take politics at all as seriously as people do in the West. They had a moment about 20 years ago where the grip of the LDP was challenged for a short time, and they tried prime ministers from other parties. That proved to be very disappointing and didn't really change much or go anywhere. And so they basically just switched back to the LDP. What I have noticed, however, is that there's a lot more women coming into politics. There's going to be an election in Tokyo for the governor between a couple of women. But it's all very cosmetic and superficial, that sort of aspect of politics.
How has the rise of China affected Japanese politics? It seems like Japan's doing a lot more to fund its military and to arm itself against the rise of China.
Yeah, that was mainly prompted by America electing Trump. They thought, oh, God, we can't rely on the Americans anymore. And then by Putin invading the Ukraine, which suggested that the rules of the game had changed somewhat. And so they decided that the time had come to boost their military spending. I think it's quite a logical, reasonable response. I mean, I think America will also continue to be a presence in the Pacific area. And of course, if America sort of withdraws to some degree from Europe, they'll have more resources to spend on Asia. But the problem America has is it lacks credibility as a superpower because it's not really willing to get its hands dirty. And I think this is something that the rivals to American power are becoming increasingly aware of, and it seems to be something that Putin was aware of when he went into the Ukraine. And American power will work as long as it can find other countries willing to do the die-in. And right now the Ukrainians are quite willing to fulfill that part of the coalition deal. And in Asia, there'll have to be a lot of calculations made by the various parties. So America's not really seen as a reliable coalition partner by a lot of countries now. The global system itself is increasingly under threat by this multipolarity and by the kind of weak center, which is America, and its sort of understandably isolationist tendencies. I mean, you can't really blame some people for being attracted by this policy. I'm just saying that it has pros and cons, So what looks like a good deal to Americans, like withdrawing from the rest of the world, might seem like a good way to cut costs and so on. But there will be consequences. America does benefit from its global position and from this so-called global order. And if that collapses into chaos, that could come back home to affect America.
If let's say Putin takes all of Ukraine that he wants, how does that affect, if at all, the well-being of American citizens?
Why does Putin need to take a part of Ukraine? The reason he needs to take a part of Ukraine is because he runs his society, he stifles other points of view, he stifles opposition. So he needs to be offering Russia something in return for giving up its liberty. And so it's a similar deal to the one that people like Adolf Hitler and Mussolini offered to their populations, like a lack of dissidence, a lack of freedom, a lack of opposition to the center in return for a increasing sense of importance and glory in the world. And so if Putin takes a slice of Ukraine, then probably a few years later, he's going to have to come back for another slice. And then he'll have to come back for reasserting Russian interests in the Baltic states and so on. So there's something inherently destabilizing about Russia. And that has to be held in check at some line. And it's probably better if the line is closer to Moscow than further away from Moscow.
But reading between the lines, you're admitting that it wouldn't make any difference in the lives of American citizens, at least not immediately.
Well, I think it would, because it would affect the global economic picture. It would affect the European economies. Europe would have to switch to a more militaristic culture. Eventually, this would leads to a kind of multipolar world of increasingly authoritarian and militaristic powers. And then if America didn't play along with that, they would be in trouble too. America basically gets a lot of its resources, a lot of its products from overseas. So you can't really escape the global economy, especially an incredibly globalized country like America. It would also create all sorts of refugee flows, no doubt, things like that. So I can see it affecting America. Of course, America would be more cushioned against all that, obviously, but it would definitely affect America.
Anything going on in the Middle East that has your attention these days?
Let's see, there's not really much going on at the moment, is there? I mean, it's pretty quiet, isn't it, the Middle East? It's a bit sleepy, I would say.
Well, you've got the Houthis cutting off traffic through the Suez Canal. We've got a war that's currently limited between Israel and Hezbollah, but could kick into high gear at any time. And we've got a highly unstable situation in the Middle East that at any time you would expect could become dramatically more intense.
Yeah. Well, I think those oil tankers are insured, so I wouldn't worry too much about them. Hezbollah, they like to have a few pot shots at Israel and vice versa. Yeah, I don't really see anything happening yet. I mean, I think probably we should be looking at how long Netanyahu can survive. Not really sure what the strategy is. What do you think Netanyahu's strategy to win in Gaza is, Luke?
I think he understands that Israel needs to maintain complete military access to any part of Gaza. So essentially, he understands that Israel has to take on the security management of Gaza, and this might last indefinitely, which is obviously not an ideal situation, but I think he recognizes it as inevitable. I think I find it most interesting. The situation I find most interesting is that Israel seems to be eager to go to war with Hezbollah, and Hezbollah does not want to go to war with Israel. And I think it's interesting that Israel wants to go to war with Iran, and Iran does not want to go to war with Israel. So I may be completely off, but that's my read of the most important developments in the Middle East that I've gained from reading people such as Graham Wood in The Atlantic.
Yeah, well, my impression is that Israel is just gaining increasing unpopularity without really achieving anything solid in return. I mean, if you compare Israel to, say, Putin, Putin has gained a lot of unpopularity in the world, but he's sort of gained a little bit of land in the Ukraine and a couple of bits of Georgia, you know what I mean? So he's got something out of it, you could say, depending on how the whole thing ends, With Netanyahu, he's in the West Bank, he's in Gaza. A lot of people are very upset. People are dying every day. This is getting reported in the West and elsewhere. A lot of people are getting alienated from the state of Israel. They're comparing it to apartheid South Africa and Nazi Germany. And so it's becoming more and more unpopular. But there's no solid territorial, geopolitical, strategic gains coming out of this. So, yeah, maybe the Iranians and the leaders of Hezbollah are quite intelligent, subtle actors. They're playing the long game.
And have you been reading any good books lately?
Oh, yeah, one or two. Have you heard of Politics on the Edge by Rory Stewart?
Yes.
That's quite a readable book, quite an interesting book. It sort of really exposes a lot of things about the way democracies work and, how kind of fake they are deep down, how kind of hollowed out they are, and how much is left to kind of permanent civil servants, how ineffectual politicians can be, how petty-minded voters are, all these kind of things. And, he's actually quite a centrist, pro-democratic type of guy, but it's sort of interesting that the book he's written, it's almost more effective at demolishing our democratic paradigm than any propaganda the Russians or the Chinese could come up with.
How do you think other countries might react to Joe Biden's obvious cognitive decline? Do you think they might feel more free to be aggressive?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I don't think they're that naive. I don't think they're going to assume that Joe Biden is actually the guy pushing all the buttons. Yeah, it does add to the degree of confusion that people perceive in America. I mean, certain countries have read America and they've come to certain conclusions that yes, we can destabilize America if we keep it below the radar. We can throw a few curveballs at America. We can stir things up. You know, so there are certain weaknesses that our relatively open democratic societies have, and they have been, I think, fully exploited in the last few years. And I think they will continue to do that unless we evolve some kind of resistance to that. And so it's kind of interesting to see Julian Assange come to a deal with America. They didn't really get what they wanted there. You know, Julian Assange was part of an operation really to kind of by the Russians to hack important government people's emails and weaponize that in a US election. And the Americans wanted to try and, exact some sort of revenge for that. But at the end of the day, it looks like they didn't really get away with much there. They didn't really get much revenge.
So I often have contempt for the trite level of analysis by most right-wing pundits, and I think you share my contempt, and you've written a thoughtful essay analyzing Matt Goodwin, who is a big deal in British right-wing politics, punditry. Any thoughts on Matt Goodwin? He's an academic who you would hope would have been more thoughtful than the less educated pundits.
Yes and no. I mean, pundits have to sell something, and they, rather than analyze things, they kind of analyze what their readers want and then end up giving it to them in many cases, especially if that's their way of making a living. I think if it's not your way of making a living, you're a bit more disinterested and you're more likely to be objective. Matt Goodwin's analysis is that, the woke elites, this is a way of social signaling. Like, the more woke you are, the more cool or high status you appear to be. And this is just a ludicrous thesis.
Who are right-wing pundits that have your respect, or public intellectuals?
Oh, God. You put me on the spot now, Luke. Well, I like the Luke Ford show, to be honest. I like the SJJ show. I think that's a good show.
Yes.
So, yeah, I've got my favorites. I won't deny it.
Yeah, SJJ has a gift. He has a gift for common sense and for reading people. How would you articulate the gift of Stephen J. James?
Well, I think it's a kind of high-functioning, low-level autism, and it sort of like hits gold on a regular basis.
Yeah. He's got something. He is intelligent. He's got his own way of reading reality. That which often you hear a point that he makes. He goes, "Oh yeah, that's obvious," and I didn't see it until I heard him articulate that. Anything going on with the leaders of what used to be known as the alt-right? Anything you've noticed from Nick Fuentes or Milo Yiannopoulos or Richard Spencer or Mike Enoch or any of that crowd?
Not in the last couple of weeks anyway. I sometimes, look into them and see how they're doing. Yeah, by and by, they've kind of faded from the scene, a lot of them. Obviously, Nick Fuentes hasn't. He's still very much in the mix. But, he's kind of boring. He's this Christian nationalism, yada, yada, Jews this, Jews that, yada, yada, yada. It's kind of boring now. All this kind of Groyper stuff, all this Bronze Age pervert stuff, all these little petty alt-right cults seem to be disappearing up their own arses, to be honest.
What's your perspective on Bronze Age Pervert, who I believe is a man of Romanian ancestry who did a PhD, I believe, in politics at an elite university and then achieved considerable acclaim online? Any thoughts on Bronze Age Pervert?
Well, it's just Nietzsche and baby talk. It's just rubbish. It's the sort of garbage that you can't believe it actually, became a bit of a hit with people. So it must be some sort of weird psyop.
What about the character named Academic Agent?
Yeah, I've sort of analysed him in my Who's Who of the Dissident Right. His analysis is complete garbage, such as it is. Don't really have much more to add than I've already expressed in my Who's Who in the Dissident Right article on him.
Okay, so he's of Iranian heritage, I believe. Anything going on with millennial woes that you're aware of?
Well, I mean, all these people, they all fit into certain categories. Like millennial woes, to a certain degree, he fits into the same category as academic agent. They're both what I classify as sub-whites, and therefore they're attracted to this essentially neo-Nazi or pseudo-neo-Nazi way of the world, you know, and they want to attain whiteness through radical right-wing identitarianism. That's their kind of way to fit in, you know. So if you look at the dissident right, the alt-right in general, you'll find that a lot of them are basically sub-whites or quasi-whites. I think I prefer that term, or sub-masculines or manlets. So there's always something psychological going on with most members of the dissident right. That's what I've noticed anyway.
And Matt Forney, any read on Matt Forney?
Yeah, I kind of miss Matt Forney because I always thought he was an entertaining writer. I quite liked his podcasts. He was very much involved with Daniel Freeberg. And, Daniel Freeberg, I've always thought he's a bit of a suspicious character as well. Some people used to say that Matt Forney was a ghostwriter for the Daily Stormer. And yeah, sometimes stylistically, I could see some of that, but there's no clear proof of that. So that's just a rumor. But yeah, I'd like to see Matt Forney make more content. I don't think his Terror House project is doing anything particularly useful or important. He seems to be afraid to come back to the United States, though. Is he still in Mexico?
I have no idea. And anything going on with Richard Spencer? He's very active. He's got a Substack. He's continually producing content.
What is his content now? Is it this Apollonianism, is it?
Yeah, it's his new religion.
What I've noticed is that a lot of the foot soldiers at Charlottesville have been prosecuted, driven to suicide, whatever. But Richard has remained miraculously untouched, unprosecuted. So I've always thought that's a bit odd.
Yeah. And not just that, but I remember a Southern Poverty Law Center researcher and quite equivalently an Antifa leftist activist said, leave Richard alone. I remember that on a podcast that effectively people on the left believe that Richard Spencer is now doing the work of God. Yeah,
I ran a story on that. So yeah, I definitely heard that, and I thought, what the fuck is that? So.
And Charles Johnson, an eccentric character on the fringes of the distant right, who's friends with Matt Gaetz. And any thoughts on Chuck Johnson?
No, I'm going to have to leave, Lou, because all these names, as soon as you mention them, I have to stifle laughter, and I just have to bite my tongue. It's just the names themselves are hilarious to me.
Okay, great to talk to you, Colin. Thanks for coming by.
Okay, right. Nice talking to you, Luke. Cheers.
Okay, cheers, mate.